afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the board. On behalf of Top Hat Consulting, I would like to thank you for inviting us here today and listening as we aim to provide you with the most beneficial recommendation for responding to your current public relations challenge and moving your company forward. My name is Sarah Klass.
I am Megan Christopher.
I'm Alex Overdyking.
And I'm Nate Smith.
Johnson & Johnson was founded as a family business in New Brunswick, New Jersey in 1886 by brothers Robert, James, and Edward Johnson. When Robert was CEO in 1943, he laid out the responsibilities of Johnson & Johnson in your now renowned credo. The credo is all about putting people above profits and making sure that the actions and words of the company reflect the right behavior.
Johnson & Johnson is currently involved in 4,200 cases, 17 of which this year alone have made it to the federal level, accusing your company of severe injury and even death of your consumers. Now, the money for these settlements is taken out of an account called accrued liabilities. You call it simply the cost of doing business. You set aside nearly $1 billion every year, which is an extremely high amount because your company recognizes that you practice negligent behavior instead of advocating for the rights of your consumers and practicing your credo. I'm going to hand it off to my associate, Nate Smith, for the legal implications that complicate this case.
Good afternoon. Today I'm going to serve as your legal consultant as we walk through what you are and are not doing right. Now, first I'd like to point out the legal implications. There are two main aspects that I'd like to focus on. Both of these, as legal standards as they may be, serve to trickle down into both areas, both ethical and financial. The inability of your company to uphold these two simple principles I'm about to demonstrate is the reason why you've been suffering numerous legal violations, and is thus why I'm going to focus on these two. One being the off-label marketing techniques that you as Johnson & Johnson have been using to promote your products. Second are the kickbacks that have been provided to doctors and pharmacists in order for you to put your products in the eye of the consumer. Both of these combined together have served as the baseline to then create even more legal boundaries, as you may say, that you have to now cross because of the activities you've been participating in. So keep your attention right here for me. This is the three-step plan that I want to emphasize, specifically with, as we will talk later today, marketing to children and the elderly. First, with the drug Risperdal. Risperdal has been marketed as being a drug that can decrease the side effects of those suffering from dementia, schizophrenia, or even those that are between the ages of 10 and 17 from behavioral disorders. Now, this drug has been not only misleading, but has used off-labeling techniques that have not been approved by the FDA, and as I will show you later, numerous other laws, including the Federal Drug and Cosmetic Act. That is going to be one of the drugs of focus today. Second, adherence to the FDCA regulations. As you will see in the presentation, the FDCA Act, it was established in 1938, and it serves as the godfather, if you will, of the FDA as well as the FDCA Act, which I will focus on as well. This is going to serve, once this law is broken, False Claims Act is broken as well, along with more off-labeling market schemes that are illegal. Last, I do not want to lose focus of the kickbacks that have been provided to nursing homes and pharmacies. One being the kickbacks granted to Omnicare, which we will get into later on. Let's first talk about the actual acts that have been violated and the laws that have been broken. First being the FTC guidelines. The FTC guidelines, Federal Trade Commission, the goal is to protect the consumer. Johnson & Johnson in 2006 acted to acquire Pfizer Corporation in an act to monopolize further the pharmaceutical industry. This act right here, under Code of Federal Regulations Title 21, prohibited such an act, claiming that not only were these products, you were going to narrow the focus that the consumers could choose from, but the products were going to be misrepresented using, again, off-label marketing techniques. Second, violating the FDA regulations. The FDA Modernization Act of 1997 allows for our company, your company, Johnson & Johnson, to do two things. One, let the doctors and pharmacists know what the off-label uses of the product can be. Second, you're allowed to let them know the economic efficiency of the drug, whether it will or will not save them money. However, you are in no way, shape, or form allowed to convey your points in any manner that leads them to believe that they can save money and benefit from this. This is paired perfectly with the illegal act of providing a payoff to the company in order to carry your product. This act is what rests on many of the decisions that we are making throughout this case at the FDA governs a lot of these actions. Third, violating the FFDCA, which is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This act to protect companies from any of the processes that a drug may go through, whether it is in a company, whether it is through the manufacturing process, or the side effects that may be associated with the drug. To highlight briefly, Risperdal, which we will again show later, was known to, in the off-labeling marketing techniques, in 2006, it became legal to market it to children. But your company had a marketing scheme that started in 1999 and ran to 2005, violating numerous FDA regulations saying that you were not allowed to market to children, because it was not legal at that point. Only in 1993 was it legal to market this drug to the adult population. In 2001, your company found out that there may be some negative side effects to the drug, Risperdal. And again, you neglected the warnings of the FDA, which has resulted in numerous payoffs and financial ramifications that Alex will talk with you later. Now let's talk briefly more about the off-label promotion to the Exceller Incorporated. Exceller Incorporated, as a result of not following FDA regulations regarding implants in the pharmaceutical industry, one having to do with the respiratory system, they violated FDA regulations because it had not been approved to sell. As a result, they then violated the False Claims Act, which states that no information that has not been identified nor verified by the FDA may be submitted to our national government. As a result of them believing that this material thing that is resides in the body, they provided their results to Medicare and Medicaid. These are healthcare professionals, thus violating once again the False Claims Act. Second, Risperdal was promoted to treat behavioral disturbances, and Janssen Pharmaceuticals was at fault, a subsidiary of your company. The goal of Janssen's was to maximize and grow Risperdal's market leadership in geriatrics and long-term care. Long-term care that we see later that your corporation said was not your main goal. Don't market to the elderly and don't market to children. Elder care sales force was even brought on to market this drug further in nursing homes and doctor's offices. Keep in mind now, let's focus on more illegal actions and cases that have been brought up. Keep in mind, 3 settlements, 3 drugs, 3 payoffs. Boston settlement, national settlement, 5-state settlement. Millions, billions of dollars lost. Why? Because the company violated the Massachusetts Consumer Protection Act, which protects customers from drugs that have not been verified by the FDA. Second, the national settlement, kickbacks were provided to increase prescriptions for Risperdal and Invega. Second, illegal off-label marketing schemes were once again implemented. And third, it violated the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act once again. Last, kickbacks were provided to Omnicare, the provider of pharmaceutical drugs. Omnicare would move patients from one nursing home to another simply because they did not take the drugs offered by Johnson & Johnson. This leads us straight into talking about the payoffs. Now let's move from the domestic side into the international side. Johnson & Johnson has recently undergone violated SEC regulations, specifically the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In order to get their product out in the market even further, they went into 4 countries: Poland, Greece, Bolivia, and Iraq. All 4 of these countries, the doctors were provided kickbacks in order to accept contracts to promote this drug further, research to further what they are already currently doing, and also, most notably, the United Nations Oil for Food Program, which took place with Iraq. In order to participate in this and to allow Iraq to sell the drugs, Johnson & Johnson was able to obtain 19 more contracts for their drugs, which came from illegal kickbacks. All in all, the legal ramifications that have taken place here today are causing your company not only to lose a lot of money, as Alex will tell you in a few moments, but they have violated FDA regulations, FDCCA, the Foreign Corruptions Act, and the Federal Trade Commissions Act, which tries to protect the consumers all the time, everywhere. Alex, I'm going to hand this over to Alex.
We will now discuss the financial implications of this case. In 2016, Johnson & Johnson generated $71.89 billion in revenues. 9% of this, as indicated by this graphic, came from the sale of consumer products. This amount totaled $6.47 billion. The other 91%, totaling $65.42 billion, came from the sale of medical and prescription drugs. It is clear that medical and prescription drugs is a money-making machine for your company. However, what will you sacrifice to generate these profits? We will first look at direct-to-consumer advertising. This form of advertising is only legal in the United States and New Zealand. In 2015, $5.4 billion was spent on direct-to-consumer ads. The same year, Americans spent a total of $457 billion on prescription drugs. It is clear that this form of advertising is an effective marketing strategy. However, great responsibility comes with this form of advertising, as consumers are no longer under the influence of the professional opinion of their doctors. According to Johnson & Johnson's financial records, $2.4 billion was spent on advertising in 2016. Johnson & Johnson spends the most money on sales and marketing compared to other companies in the pharmaceutical industry. In 2013, Johnson & Johnson spent $17.5 billion on sales and marketing compared to a mere $8.2 billion on research and development. Pharmaceutical companies have the ethical responsibility to ensure the health of their patients. However, this is put into question when your company spends more than twice as much on marketing your product than in perfecting this product to maximize benefits to patients. As seen here, Johnson & Johnson sits in third in the pharmaceutical industry for the most settlements paid over the last decade. Your company's civil and criminal settlements and charges are approaching $3 billion. The majority of this total came from one charge in 2013 when your company had to pay over $2.2 billion for off-label marketing and kickbacks. However, this big charge did not result in any significant changes, as you're one of 14 companies labeled as repeat offenders. The pharmaceutical industry generated $711 billion in profits over the 10-year period between 2003 and 2012. Over the 25-year period between 1991 and 2015, companies were faced with only $35.7 billion in profits. Although the pharmaceutical industry is fined billions of dollars for off-label marketing, the profits that they make heavily outweigh these penalties. To make matters worse, the settlements and penalties are decreasing over the years. According to an analysis by Public Citizen, in 2014 and 2015, only $2.4 billion in financial penalties were recovered, compared to $8.7 billion in 2012 and 2013. However, the number of these settlements decreased only slightly, from 22 to 19 settlements. This indicates that the average size of the settlements decreased from $395 million per settlement to $126 million per settlement. Although there has been a decrease in penalties, this is not an excuse for your company to continue practicing unethical behavior. The reason that these penalties are decreasing is because as the federal government sees that companies are implementing a program of ethics and compliance, they will lessen the penalties. However, if your company refrains from making these changes, you could be faced with government reform and increase in penalties. As indicated by your credo, your company prioritizes the following: patients first, profits last. However, by participating in off-label marketing, you are putting your profits first. It seems as though you would rather increase profits than provide patients with the proper treatment they need. The sale of drugs for a use other than one approved by the FDA has caused many health complications and even deaths among your clients. I am sure you have considered the financial benefit of off-label marketing, but have you considered the value of a human life? According to the most recent valuation by the FDA, a human life is worth $7.9 million. There certainly has not been a cost-benefit analysis of human life in your financial considerations. We will now consider the value of business ethics and what it can do for your company. If you do not adjust your current ethical standards and values, you will maintain current profits for shareholders and continue paying settlements in the short term. However, by changing your ways and implementing a better ethic program, you will avoid the additional cost of these penalties. You will also outperform the S&P 500 by 3.3%. The Ethisphere Institute, a global leader in defining and advancing the standards of ethical conduct, honors the world's most ethical companies. The companies that receive this honor are outperforming the S&P 500 by 3.3%. In addition, by implementing a better business ethics program, you can increase your brand equity, one of the most important intangible assets a company possesses, that is influenced by how credible your customers view your brand. The current value of your goodwill is $21.82 billion, but by implementing a better ethics program, this can certainly increase. The reduction of fines and penalties is another factor to consider. This cost of doing business will be eliminated, allowing for an increase in profits. Finally, Johnson & Johnson has the opportunity to set the industry standard of ethical conduct for pharmaceutical companies. Although in the short term you will have to make some sacrifices, you will greatly benefit in the long run by implementing these changes. Sarah Class will now explore the ethical considerations of this case.
Thank you, Alex. This brings us to the final section to be discussed today before our recommendation, the ethical implications of Johnson & Johnson's behavior. I would first like to start with a story. This is Austin Pledger. In 2002, Austin was an 8-year-old boy from Alabama who suffered from severe autism. When he began Risperdal, he became frustrated less often and had fewer tantrums. But he would still periodically erupt in volatile behavior, biting himself and dropping to the floor and pounding his head. And the side effects that ensued far outweighed any advancements. When Austin was 12 years old, he began growing breasts that grew to a size 46 double D. Risperdal had deformed Austin because of the side effect called gynecomastia. Risperdal increases your levels of prolactin, which is the hormone that produces milk in pregnant women, which leads to the abnormal breast growth. Austin could tell by looking at himself that he looked more like his mother than his father. And this resulted in him being embarrassed of his body and ashamed of what he looked like. Eventually, Austin was taken off of Risperdal and even won a $2.5 million settlement. But Austin will never be the same. Because of Risperdal, thousands of boys like Austin Pledger will never be the same. But Risperdal was one of Johnson & Johnson's moneymakers, bringing in nearly $18 billion for the company. Unfortunately, in order to get there, your company engaged in illegal marketing practices, including marketing Risperdal to children, paying doctors to speak favorably of the drug, and paying kickbacks. So what exactly is this miracle drug that has created so much wealth, yet brought upon such significant problems for your company? Janssen, one of Johnson & Johnson's subsidiaries, created risperidone, the antipsychotic commonly known as Risperdal, which was FDA approved in 1993 to treat schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. In 2006, Risperdal was finally approved to also treat irritability caused by autism. But before its approval, the two constituents of the market that were off limits were children and the elderly. But that did not stop the off-label marketing efforts that eventually led to your $2.2 billion settlement, the largest settlement ever for the illegal marketing of one drug. But the most common defense for this illegal marketing was that it was the doctors who decided who used the drug, not Johnson & Johnson. All the folks at Johnson & Johnson did was provide them with information, which is their First Amendment right. This argument would be valid if that were all that had happened. In children, Risperdal's major side effects include vomiting and headaches. On top of these is also gynecomastia. In 2001, the relationship between Risperdal and gynecomastia was discovered. And yet, your marketing efforts continued. In 2003, your company embarked on a back-to-school campaign. In San Antonio, one manager told his salespeople to host ice cream parties in pediatricians' offices in order to promote and celebrate Risperdal. Another manager told her salespeople to make sure to include lollipops and small toys in the sample packages that she gave to doctors. Doctors who prescribed the most Risperdal were then recruited on behalf of your company to be paid speakers. In other words, doctors were being bribed and children were being manipulated. And this goes far beyond the First Amendment right argument. Another common off-label use of Risperdal was for elderly patients with dementia, even though there was no significant evidence to suggest that Risperdal had any positive effect. Eventually, the FDA required a black box warning on Risperdal because of the serious health effects that ensued to elderly. These warnings are the strictest that can be applied to a drug. Their appearance on packaging symbolizes that the use of this drug for elderly can lead to serious effects, even death. And yet it was not applied to Risperdal until 2005, after the drug had already been off-label marketed to elderly dementia patients for years. Risperdal was created as the successor to your previous antipsychotic drug, whose patent had expired. However, the FDA says that Risperdal was not necessarily any better than the previous drug, and was really only effective for treating schizophrenia in adults. But this small market was not enough for your ambitious sales division. Although elderly and children were off limits and forbidden markets, 46% of your sales came from elderly and children. Your company recklessly put at risk some of the most vulnerable members of our society. Don't get me wrong, Risperdal is a good drug, and it can help people, but it was marketed too broadly, and the system failed to protect consumers. Johnson & Johnson is a company known for its outstanding credo. It begins with, "We believe our first responsibility is to the doctors, nurses, and patients, to the mothers and fathers, and anyone else who uses our products and services. In meeting their needs, everything we do must be of high quality." But the world in which Johnson & Johnson thrives today seems to have corroded these values. Holding ice cream parties in pediatricians' offices, even though children were a forbidden market, does not hold true to conducting business of high quality. Another market that must be addressed are your stakeholders. You have an obligation to your stakeholders. Patients first, profits last. This promise is a constituent to this promise is critical to the relationship that you have with your stakeholders. When making decisions, you must take these into account. And the key stakeholders for this case are patients, parents, management, the medical community, shareholders, and even your consultants standing before you today. Your actions represent a serious breach of trust with these stakeholders. You say that your obligation is to your stakeholders, an obligation to act ethically and responsibly. But marketing to children and elderly, even though they were forbidden markets, goes against these credo promises. Shareholders were meant to be your last obligation. And yet, they were the ones that you marketed to. They were the ones that you put above your other stakeholders in order to make a profit. Mothers and fathers who are responsible for making decisions for the best interest of their children found themselves administering medication to their children that caused more harm than good. Elderly patients with serious ailments such as dementia need to rely on the wisdom and guidance of their doctors and companies like Johnson & Johnson to make decisions. And yet both parents and the elderly were pushed aside in order to make your company a profit. If you are faced with a difficult decision about business conduct, you should ask yourself these questions. In your Johnson & Johnson Code of Business Conduct, you have this diagram. The values that represent your decision-making process are clearly stated and spelled out. Is the conduct a violation of Johnson & Johnson Code of Business Conduct, company policy, or the law? When it comes to off-label marketing and the bribing that ensued, the answer is yes. Is the conduct inconsistent with our credo responsibilities? Again, the answer is yes. Will this conduct appear unethical to stakeholders outside of the company? Yes. Could the conduct harm my reputation or the reputation of Johnson & Johnson? Yes, and it has. Your company has an obligation to act ethically and to adhere to ethical marketing practices. And this diagram right here gives you an actionable process for making sure you do so. But it was ignored. Mr. Gorski, you told a reporter that the Johnson & Johnson Code of Business Conduct guides your decisions, and that these settlements have given you appropriate accountability to move forward. And moving forward is why we're here today. It is time to reaffirm your 131-year commitment to consumer care, and take advantage of the opportunity to lead in an industry that has increasingly been plagued by actual harm. And now I'd like to hand it to Megan, who will talk about our recommendation for moving forward.
Thank you, Sarah. In this next and final section of the presentation, we're going to go through a step-by-step analysis of what Johnson & Johnson can do to reconstruct their ethics and compliance program to better execute your credo. This is our roadmap to success. We're going to start with addressing where you're failing in your existing program, doing a brief analysis of the entire pharmaceutical industry, and then looking internally and seeing where you failed to execute your credo and where your current ethics and compliance program is failing you. Then we'll look at the new standard for ethical business set by Ethisphere. We'll look at Eli Lilly and Company, which is the only pharmaceutical company ranked on their published list every year. Finally, we're going to go through the new Ethics and Compliance Department step by step in order for Johnson & Johnson to better execute their credo. All right, so we'll begin with that brief analysis of the pharmaceutical industry. 8 out of 9 pharmaceutical industries, the big names such as Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, are facing similar charges of Johnson & Johnson. They've had to settle federal lawsuits addressing severe death or injury to their consumers. Your industry has established that it's no big deal to practice unethical marketing as long as 1, no senior staff members or executives are being arrested, or 2, it does not affect your stock prices. Now, excuse me. You've routinely, as Sarah mentioned before, you've routinely violated your credo because your company thinks you have to lower your ethical standards in order to stay competitive. And we're here to show you that that is not the case. This is how your current ethics program is constructed. It is a subset of your HR system. There's a committee consists of senior leaders from different corporate functions, and they periodically report to the executive leadership team. You conduct internal audits of compliance in different company functions, but the fact that there is no central office for ethics and compliance creates corporate lag and inconsistency to how you address ethical issues. Now we're going to look at the new standard of ethical business. Ethisphere Institute, as Alex had mentioned earlier, is a global leader in defining and advancing standards of ethical business practices fueled by corporate character, marketplace trust, and business success. Now there's several different elements that they consider when looking at an ethical company. 35% ethics and compliance, so they look specifically at the company's benchmarks of what they consider ethical behavior. 20% corporate citizenship and responsibility, 20% culture of ethics, 15% governance, and 10% leadership, innovation, and reputation. That specifically looks at the company's legal compliance and your ethical reputation within the marketplace. Eli Lilly Company is the only company that made Ethisphere's most ethical businesses, meaning they're the most ethical pharmaceutical company in the industry right now. If you look at their executive leadership team, the vice president of the entire company is the enterprise risk manager and chief ethics and compliance officer. They have compliance and enterprise risk management in every company function, and they have internal lines of communication that foster dialogue between management and employees. Now we're going to go through the step-by-step process of reconstructing your ethics and compliance program, starting with appointing the chief of ethics and compliance onto your officer's executive leadership team. Then you're going to re-examine the company's mission, values, goals, and policies, create and analyze relevant information to see where there's deficiencies in the current system, then verify your results by hiring an external auditing firm. Finally, publish your findings in your annual report. This is crucial to stay transparent to build trust with stakeholders. Finally, the external auditing firm that we recommend is IBECC Global. They are the world's leaders in reconstructing ethics and compliance programs. They are committed to protecting the organization's legal, financial, and regulatory risks. They do that by strengthening policies, matching training programs with actual risk, by giving employees actionable and reasonable solutions to address ethical issues. They capture every report for proof of misconduct. And finally, they ensure engagement. If you follow all of these steps, we believe Johnson & Johnson will have the tools that they need to successfully execute your credo and your leadership imperatives, which are connect, shape, deliver, and lead. On behalf of Top Hat Consulting, we would like to thank you for having us here today and open the floor for any questions.
Thank you very much.
I'll lead off. I have real problems with you benchmarking our company against Ethisphere. I don't know if you've looked at other benchmarks, but Ethisphere they may recognize themselves as the industry standard, but there really isn't any company can make the decision that they're going to go into business and determine who's ethical and who's not, based on certain criteria, and in some cases based on there have been winners who have marketed and paid money to Ethisphere for various programs and activities. So I am not taking that seriously, but I'd like to understand, as you've looked at the industry, for example, whether or not our research and development budget, which you indicate is less than half of our marketing, whether or not you know that this is a deviant from industry standards, or whether you know that other companies are fairly much in alignment with that. Because you're making some assumptions about us that I really need to hear more specifics about how you got your data. And so tell me what you know about other pharmaceutical companies' marketing and research versus research and development versus marketing.
I'll start out why we use Ethisphere and Eli Lilly Company. We did a research of many different benchmarking systems of what rates an ethical company, and Ethisphere just had the most clear cut how they ranked systems. And of course, beyond Eli and Lilly Company, we looked at several other companies in the industry: GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, and we picked Eli and Lilly Company mostly because in all of the research, they had the most proportional research and development versus with marketing. They had the most proportional budget. They were also ranked most ethical, not only on Ethisphere standards, but others. And
what others have ranked? What other standards were you using besides Ethisphere?
We looked at other lists published by Forbes, Bloomberg, Wall Street, and we understand all of these might be objective.
But they don't judge the ethics of a company. Forbes, Bloomberg, and I mean they don't say who's ethical and who isn't, right?
Right. Well, they were specifically talking in articles about ethical business practice in pharmaceuticals, and throughout all of our research, Eli Lilly and Company came up several times as practicing what many sources have found ethical business standards for the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. We don't want to set a rigid standard of ethical business based on Ethisphere standards. That wasn't the intent. What we wanted to do was show you why we came up with the Eli Lilly and Company. But Eli Lilly and Company is not only company that we looked at. For example, one of our recommendations was hiring on a new chairperson on the executive leadership team. Eli and Lilly Company isn't the only company that has an ethics and compliance officer on their executive leadership team. I believe Pfizer is another company that does. We just wanted to use different benchmarks to show how we were looking at taking an approach of what.
It would be great, and thank you for what you gave me, but I still don't have an awareness of the specifics around research and development, statistics being different at other companies than they are at Johnson & Johnson versus marketing. So I'm just wondering if you can give me any other statistics when you said, you made it the case that this was egregious, and so I just want to understand what the context is of how others fared. Do you happen to have that data with you? Or?
Yeah, you could see from the graph that we pulled up, it compared Johnson & Johnson to the other companies in the pharmaceutical industry, and Johnson & Johnson had spent more money on research and development compared to others, on sales and marketing, sorry, compared to other companies. And frankly, the proof seems to be in the pudding with how many penalties that Johnson & Johnson has been faced with. And you can see Johnson & Johnson is compared to other companies such as Novartis and Pfizer. And you can see that their sales and marketing costs are quite bigger than the other companies.
And are you comparing how big Johnson & Johnson is with each of the other companies to get an aggregate example?
You can see
Because
by
they're all
Lilly
different
that,
sizes.
that the 5.7 and the 5.5, it doesn't matter which is which, they're still spending a similar amount of money.
Thank you.
It seems as though you concentrated quite a bit on Risperdal, and I'm wondering if you had any data or evidence as to any of the other drugs that you talked about Johnson & Johnson specifically marketing, and in what was a fashion of violating the different government entities. Can you give us some data on some of those other drugs that may have been a part of this? Or do you think that a single drug, Risperdal, would bring Johnson & Johnson down?
Yes, sir. Two of the ones that stood out to me were, or us as a consulting firm, is Accelerant and Invega. Invega is very similar to Risperdal in the fact that it focuses very much on schizophrenia and bipolar disorders. However, what we found with that is, as that is violated, and I let's see, a little bit more as that's violated, I'll focus right here with those two. As that focuses on what Risperdal tried to do, a lot of lawsuits came around because that, if you will, a domino effect. It was very similar to that, and as I said, Accelerant, with their marketing schemes and what they were violating. The FDA, it was the guidelines set forth were not only manipulated, but they were ignored because the FDA set in place that obviously with the off-label marketing schemes that your company has been interacting with, you were required by the FDA and the FDA Modernization Act that when you let the company know what the off-label marketing arenas may look like in treating not just bipolar disorders, but attention deficit disorders or a common headache, that you had to dive further into the effects. You have failed to do so. The statistics on that are smaller in that area, but larger when it comes to Accelerant. What happened with Accelerant is that actually was in part with Accelerant Incorporated. The fact that they're a subsidiary of your company. The fact that the FDA had not approved the use of your medical devices is the reason why the False Claims Act then resulted, because the information that pharmaceutical companies were now providing was false in regards of Medicare and Medicaid. So that drug furthered the issue. The actual drug of Risperdal is one of our huge concerns, also the other drugs as well, because there are a lot of other actions that as that drug continues to be in the marketplace, the off-labeling market technique, as I showed in the beginning, is the most important issue, because as these companies do not know what this drug actually does, other information is going to pop up, such as Pfizer. You tried to actually buy out part of Pfizer, and the reason that you were denied was not only by the FDA, but you were denied specifically under the Federal Trade Commission, because you were trying to monopolize the market further, and that means, and the prices were actually shown to rise, allowing for other companies to not be able to pair as much, especially because we do not know all the side effects, such as Risperdal, Invega, Accelerant, and then Omnicare, which was focused specifically on the nursing homes and assisted living facilities, which was dealing with the pharmaceutical companies themselves. So that is where the other drugs come. Did I answer?
My second question is, you talked a lot about us at Johnson & Johnson being liable for the violations because we were marketing to the elderly and the children. You didn't talk much at all about the vulnerability and the liability of the physicians. We could very easily say that we were marketing and directing our marketing to physicians because the physicians are the ones who prescribe these drugs. Certainly in today's market, there's a lot of advertising, and you and I and anyone else can go to our doctor and ask for what we want. But that doctor takes an oath, and that doctor is supposed to follow certain standards, and the doctor is the one who prescribes these drugs. So where do you draw the line between us marketing these to the doctor, to the elderly, to the underage, No one can write that prescription but the doctor.
I would like to approach this in a two-pronged approach. As you said, they take an oath. Well, also, common term is one hand washes another. By Johnson & Johnson reaching out, I'm going to tackle domestic, but specifically internationally, they are preying on the vulnerabilities of these doctors. As the violations continue to increase on these drugs with these FDA regulations, especially when they're mislabeled, as we talked briefly about, and mismarketed to the wrong consumer group, there is confusion as to what this drug is even prescribed to do. And sadly, it takes place and it becomes obvious to your company as well as the doctors and the physicians that are researching this drug. As the process goes on, in 2001, you stated that you were aware, and the Huffington Post specifically analyzed this, that you were aware of some of the negative side effects that, as we keep talking about Risperdal, had on a young boy, creating, as we talked, breasts. Specifically with the doctors, by targeting international and with the SEC violations and the acts that were violated there, you were giving them an option to not only have their medical supplies marketed, there's contracts granted, but an increased flow of customers. It put doctors, not saying that their actions were unethical, but put them in a very precarious predicament as regards to what they should do with these options, especially when the actual providers of the drugs, such as Omnicare, were being provided kickbacks. And the fact that further research was not done, these doctors could legitimately say, the ones that were not provided kickbacks, we were provided proof by Johnson & Johnson, the economic efficiency as well as the added research. One of the, if you don't mind, one more example that we had was when they were, the FD, the Federal Drug Cosmetic Act, specifically talks about some of the subsidiaries and the drugs that we are undergoing, and an investigation where actually some of the drugs were found to have been mildewed, not looked into as much, and this was a subsidiary, specifically Janssen Pharmaceuticals, as well as Accelerate Corporation. Both of these were the steps to ensure that these drugs were actually being applied to the right resources were not taken, which thus, I never am excusing unethical behavior, but it is hard when one hand is washing the other, but one hand knows a lot more than the other, especially in regards to these drugs.
Also, with that, some of the doctors, there were cases where the doctors were being bribed, and it wasn't like intentional bribing where they were being given money in order to prescribe, but like I said, they were taken on behalf of Johnson & Johnson to be paid speakers for their company as long as they prescribed specific amounts of Risperdal in their offices. So they were being bribed to sell that, to prescribe Risperdal. And yes, they took an oath, but again, it's just like how they're exhibiting illegal, it's just how you are exhibiting illegal behavior, so are the doctors.
Let's move on. Thank you. Dave?
So, your recommendation really talks about new ethical standards, new ethics and compliance departments, and yet, from your analysis and a lot of your presentation, key on, I'll say, practices that we'll debate on whether they were as inflammatory as you've expressed it, but the practice of our sales, our marketing, and our R&D, as well as, our I'll say our information packets to physicians. I'm not seeing the connection with respect to how your recommendation of a department and new standard will address what you have emphasized as being the real area of problems with respect to sales and marketing.
So I will take the majority of this question. So the structure of the Johnson & Johnson's Ethics and Compliance Program as it is right now, there's a committee of senior leaders that meet periodically to set the standards, they go on their ways, and there's different ethics and compliance programs in different cross-functional aspects of your company. There's no hierarchical structure. There's nothing to really kind of set a standard within the company. Through our recommendation, by hiring a new chairperson and creating an ethics and compliance department, we can assure uniformity. Because currently, your marketing and sales department has their own ethics and compliance function, and they don't always have to report to a higher authority. They don't always, the internal audits aren't conducted as often as they should be. So with the new structure, the new structures to ensure overseeing of that illegal and improper behavior. That's what we're trying to do with the recommendation, with the creating of the new ethics and compliance department within
And
Johnson.
if I may add one thing, Mr. Gorski was actually head for a very long time of these marketing practices before he was promoted to CEO. And so he brought in so much money for the company that he was promoted to be the CEO of your company. And he was actually one of the people who headed these illegal marketing practices.
So if you were to establish this department, are there any specific initiatives that you believe need to be implemented to address what you've identified as these deficiencies in our marketing and sales?
Different initiatives would be, the basic of restructuring the code of conduct. But we'd also have to look at several different aspects within the company, not only the marketing and sales division, but we'll also have to look at the financial division and restructuring how we're going to spend how much money on sales and marketing versus research and development to make it more proportional, because the ethics within this entire company, it needs to be more uniform, and it's not only sales and marketing, but it's the entire company. And we believe initiatives, if we create better lines of communication, a stricter code of conduct, more frequent internal audits, we can negate this behavior. Does that probably
Thank you. Dave?
Well, I'm kind of going in the same direction. You have, we have a lot of other divisions of the company and other departments within the company that are selling a heck of a lot of stuff. I don't think marketing is going to be really happy if we go in there and we say, hey, by the way, you can't sell as much of this as you used to. I mean, the whole structure of our company is profit. Our whole structure of our company is to have massive, market share. And you're suggesting that we go ahead and just put the brakes on and say, wait a minute, we've been doing some things that aren't ethical. We get it. We've been cutting some big checks, but maybe that's just collateral damage. Maybe we should just keep going with that for a while. Because what you're asking us to do here is you're really asking us to put the brakes on. Profit just has to wait for us?
Well, the structure of your company when Robert Johnson originally created this credo was actually patients first, profits last. Your last obligation is to your shareholders. All other stakeholders are meant to be taken care of beforehand. And so, yes, that does mean that profits are supposed to come in last, and that if you don't end up making as much money, that is meant to be okay, because you are now adhering to the ethical marketing practices that Robert Johnson was so proud of this company for doing.
Do you have any recommendations on how we could use this to our advantage?
Yes, because like I said, this industry has recently been plagued with so much actual harm, with the actual deaths and deformance of people, and by leading with this ethical and responsible standard, you can end up building, like Alex said, a lot more brand equity for your company, which could result in a lot more profits, because especially with this day and age, people are a lot more aware of corporate social responsibility and a lot more aware of the ethical standards of companies, and people are more likely to shop at stores and buy from companies that are more ethically responsible.
And if I may add, as I mentioned earlier, you're not the only pharmaceutical company facing these issues. 8 out of 9 big pharmaceutical companies are facing similar allegations that you are facing, that is severe injury or death of your consumers. You could spin this in a way, you could direct this in a way where you are going to be the new pharmaceutical industry leader, where you are practicing what you promise in your credo, and you are taking initiative to be a more ethical pharmaceutical company.
Well, I would have to, I hear what you're saying, and I think, I would have to take the perspective of, we have been putting patients first. In fact, we've been putting them first because we've been willing to take the risk, if you will, of being sued because we're putting products out there that are helping masses and masses of people. And yeah, there's an outlier here or an outlier there. You characterize it as the cost of doing business, but we recognize there's, you know, a Six Sigma, whatever way you want to describe it, there's an outlier. That is the cost of doing business. Unfortunately, there will be side effects, and I'd rather heal 1 million people if I'm going to have one person that may have the risk of a possible side effect.
Well, in your credo and your code of business conduct, you do bring that up, and you do mention the part of acting ethically is also one of your biggest responsibilities. And doing that is much more of a utility approach, and so that is much more of putting like the greater, it's not for the greater good, it's for, oh, if I can help this one patient. It's very different, whereas in your code of business conduct, you talk about acting ethically and responsibly and how that is more important.
So is Top Hat suggesting that we need to ensure that no one will be harmed by our medication, and so we should not put it,
Okay. Would you mind putting up the slide that has your moving forward? You have a slide about, I think you have your recommendations all in one slide or not? Okay.
These are just all of the recommendations.
You just leave that up there, that'd be great. All right. I want to focus on tomorrow. Certainly there were many things in your presentation that were well-researched and very good. I'm going to focus on the things that bothered me so that you have an opportunity to think through how you feel about that. I think that it's very dangerous to make some of the sweeping statements you made. Your role as consultants, yes, they're paying you. Your role is to be honest and direct, but your role is also not to lecture or offend. And that's a fine line. I value that you got into the research and you were passionate and you saw some things about a company that has had a great reputation and you went full force. But keep in mind your role tomorrow as well as today, you're going to shut people off. They're not going to listen. Difficult information does not get heard when there is a tone that you don't want to take when you're trying to get them to be persuaded. And you made a statement that could cause someone to sue you. You said that Gorski brought in so much money he was made CEO. And he was in charge when there were all these illegal things. The passion that we have that we can say in certain environments in class, you just can't bring into this. This is wonderful training for you going forward about how you convince people to do the difficult. And so that's what we care about, that you choose the examples tomorrow and the types of things where you want really solid ground.
And Gail, I'll just piggyback on it. And that's why I took the tack that I took with you guys. It was because of that very reason. I'm on the senior leadership team here, and you're telling me, frankly, that you guys are a bunch of crooks. I mean, that's how it came across, and that's how it felt. And so that's why I took the tack that I took of saying, well, wait a minute. You know, you spun your tail. Well, let me spin another one for you. You need kind of...
Yes, sir.
I think it's important that you recognize why you're here as a board of directors of the senior leadership team. Mr. Gorski asked you to come in. Mr. Gorski was the one who brought you in. And I think what you want to do is to recognize that Mr. Gorski recognized there were problems. He was asking you to come in and look at it. I don't think he wanted you to come in and lecture him, but I think if you identify the problems, offer the solutions in a way that is palatable, and I would suggest to you, go forward with your recommendations about the new organization, whatever. But in addition to that, tie in that you don't just create an ethics organization, but have a compliance function to go with it. And you measure what you have been able to do as a result of that compliance, or what you project being able to do as a result of that compliance. A lot of times you're talking about what are very soft numbers. Ethics is real hard to put a number on. So you want to give it your best effort at saying, how you would create what is a flow of establishing this as hopefully a fix, and we measure what it does, and when we measure what it does, it then tells us what we need to do in addition to feed back into the ethics and compliance. And I'll just give you one example. You will probably not old enough to remember this. Enron had one of the best codes of conduct that ever existed, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter, they didn't follow it.
Yeah, and I'll dovetail. The reason I went after that area there was, okay, great, you got this new department, but if it's not doing something substantial, in other words, is there going to be a new training program? Is there going to be a new initiative that says we measure, and if certain departments aren't up to a certain standard, then they get, to go back to remedial something? It's really, what is the initiative? Okay, great, you got a department, but what is it that tangibly they're going to do as an ethics and compliance department to make an impact to this problem? Tie it back to how is it they're going to impact this problem?
Are they going to bring in marketing, sales, promotion, PR, everybody else, and build a new case for Johnson & Johnson being the granddaddy of ethics? If that's the case, you got some work to do there. Right. It's not gonna stop with, we have a new department. It's just where they begin, and it's where it begins. Okay.
One of the challenges that I'm wondering about, I don't know the size of Eli Lilly, and I don't know the size of Johnson & Johnson, but I'm worried for you that you're setting apples and oranges together when you don't know the different sizes of these companies. What they spend on marketing is a function of their size and product range. And you're drawing a conclusion that you don't know you can support, because if Eli Lilly is a small company, then their nature of being in proportion may have an entirely different explanation and not necessarily speak to a greater commitment to research. It could speak to things that you don't know about. So I'm be careful tomorrow that you use facts when you talk about setting up Eli Lilly as a standard, and many refer to Eli Lilly. You might just look at, you already know Johnson & Johnson has done some very significantly positive things in the past. They've obviously corrected lots of things that you talked about that they did in the early 2000s. But clearly they've screwed up badly in 2011 and 12 and 13 or whatever because of things happening in manufacturing facilities, and they've had their share of problems. So I guess as you think about the narrower, in some ways, I think, and I welcome your thoughts, the narrower the recommendations you make, and the more you can flush them out in the 10 minutes, give something tangible for them to walk away with. I'd be hesitant to tell somebody who to hire as a compliance firm. I appreciate that you were trying to be specific, but I think you might want to look at what was there about your concerns about what they're doing that led you to think that they needed an outside person, and can you come up with a recommendation in lieu of hiring someone? Can you find something specific that you want them to do that doesn't get into you should hire someone because you guys are so stupid? I mean, the inference of that is you're so stupid you need an outside person. They may well, but think about something tangible that you were hoping that this outside firm might do and build that into your recommendation. Anyone else? Because we also have somebody in the room who works for a pharmaceutical company, and I don't know whether that person would be willing to give you feedback, but I want to make sure that we also tap into all of the judges, and if you have any more you want to say to them.
I'll just piggyback on a point that Gail made when she began her questioning regarding ethisphere. As a practitioner, if I pay the right amount, I can become one of the world's most ethical companies. And that's something to kind of bear in mind, that, within the industry and such, you're not always getting an evaluation or based on your actual ethical standards, but because you have the pockets and the ability to pay to play.
there's a lot of awards that are given. I got one last year, one of the 100 most trustworthy thought leaders. I was thrilled. But I had to ask myself, how did they base that? There's an awful lot of people that I know.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much, yes. And I'm not minimizing it, but the fact is that we don't have the criteria to really know how to judge these kinds of things. And so companies plunge in with good intentions to honor people for certain things, and that's great because it's a motivator and it's good, but without casting aspersions on ethisphere or what they do, be careful that unless you know everything you need to know about any organization that gives awards, be careful you don't use them as a benchmark, because there's stuff you may not know that can undercut the good that you have.